Good evening.
Good evening.
So thank you so much for that kind introduction. So I had a big roundup to get us started, but first of all, we're running a little late. Second of all, you didn't come here to hear me. And third of all, we want to get to it. So I'll just tell you what I was going to say quickly, which is we've talked today and we'll talk tomorrow about all the details, all the specifics of this war on drugs and its devastation that it has created across our communities and more broadly. I want to take us to the future that we're trying to create now. And the future I want to invoke is one in which historians look back on this period and think about the war on drugs the way we think about other punitive policies that we've repudiated in the past. Think about it in the way we think about torture, the way we think about witch burning, the way we think about genocide, the way we think about policies that we now think as history is past as the product of ignorance, the product of a range of social forces that we've now moved away from. If that history is ever going to be told, it is because we've been able to move the needle on this issue, not solely on the basis of cost benefit, but also on the basis of ethical, moral, and political bases as well. So key to doing that is being able to bring all pieces of the conversation together. And here tonight we have a unique opportunity to do so. So to use, for lack of a better frame, we might think about this conversation as pitched more or less at the height of the mountaintop, looking at all the thoroughfares and causeways that come together to create the terrain, and looking for detours, avenues, dams, and new directions that might move us in a direction towards elimination of this war on drugs. So let me tell you how we organize this. It's framed as a round table. And so the focus is on rounds. We're going to have rounds of conversation, both to keep us in a conversational mode and to make sure we have an opportunity to talk to each other and to talk to you. Now, everyone has given me Scout's honor that they would, or at least I tried to extract from them, a Scout's honor promise that they will abide by the time so that we can actually have the conversation that we want. So the first round, everyone's going to talk a little bit from their perspective about the picture of the elephant from their vantage point, how they see it. So we want this round to benefit from the diversity of vantage points. We have law enforcement, public health, those who work with and live among communities impacted by the war on drugs, as well as those who are advocating a fundamental shift in drug enforcement. So this is where we want to talk about how each of these vantage points give us particular purchase on the what that is happening and the whom it is happening to. Now, our second round is going to take us a little deeper into understanding the why. So given the consequences that we've talked about so far, how is it that these policies continue to wreak havoc as they do? Here we want to consider and maybe even debate different ways of understanding the why question. Then the third round, we're going to more move to the ought. What should we do given what we've talked about? And we understand for the most part that simply talking about drug policy as a bad idea or talking about the statistics and the disparities itself does not particularly move the needle. But needles have been moved in the past on issues that are similar to this. So what are the needle moving? What are the imperatives? What are the resonances that we can talk about and agree to that help us move the ethical dimensions of this conversation? And finally, in the fourth round is where we hope to really get it in. And at that point, we want to talk about the tensions and the possibilities in bringing together these disparate frames. What do we need to agree on to move forward? What can we agree to disagree about and still move collectively and productively in a direction that we hope this conversation and this broader movement will go? So it gives us an opportunity to think and talk about all of the pieces and how they fit together. So with that, I'm going to turn to our conversation and start with just the general question of what it is that each of our panelists see, what kind of story, statistic, opening picture they can give us that uniquely characterizes the cost, the consequence, the how, and the what of this issue. So I'm going to start with Soffiyah, and we're all on first name basis up here. And if we could, I would like to come down and sit in front. This just feels really formal, but we're going to try to step into it in a way that makes us all really conversational. So I'm going to go to Soffiyah first. So tell us from your perspective, what do you see?
Okay, well, first of all, I'm going to apologize for my raspy voice because I have that nagging cold that about 1/3 of New Yorkers are suffering from right now. I want to say thank you for inviting me to participate on this panel. From my perspective, at the Correctional Association, which is a 170-year-old not-for-profit organization charged with a legislative mandate to monitor the conditions throughout the prisons, a significant number of the people that we are seeing who are caged in New York State are there related to drug involvement, either directly because of their drug usage or some activity that they engaged in to acquire drugs or to support that habit. And so we see firsthand the kind of destruction that the drug war is creating for the people who are incarcerated and their families and their communities from which they come. But I want to step back a little further from that. As the audience heard, I've done a lot of things in the criminal justice arena, or I'll say the criminal injustice arena. And amongst those things has been representing people who were charged with crime. So I want to quickly talk about two young men. Tom, I'll call them Tom and Ray. Both of them are 21 years old, both of them from Boston. One, Tom, comes from a very intact, quote-unquote, family, a mother who really strove to make sure that he and his brother got a good education, provided them with opportunities to travel, made sure, warm meal on the table, took care of making sure that she tried to house them in comfortable settings, etc. But they lived in a neighborhood that was, quote-unquote, changing. And so the gang involvement became a big draw for Tom. And fast forward, when I met Tom, he was a budding artist and had aspirations to follow in the footsteps of Romare Burden and Jacob Lawrence. Well, last week while I was in Boston, I visited Tom, and he was awaiting sentencing for gun possession related to his selling drugs in connection with the guys who lived up the block who he had grown up with. And then there's Ray, whose mother had mental illness, dealt with that mental illness by drinking, had him diagnosed at about 5 years old with acute depression so that she could get his SSI check and use that to support her alcoholism problem, who provided no structure for Ray. And Ray is in solitary confinement at Walpole, and he's doing time related to his drug involvement through gangs. So two very different backgrounds for two young men in Boston landing in the same situation. And if they had been in New York City, I would have visited them in one of the 60 facilities in upstate New York. And this is the kind of story that we're hearing over and over again. Two brilliant young men who, if had not gotten involved with this drug culture, would have been able to pursue their dreams like we hope for all of our young people. And that's just a microcosm of what we're seeing for 21-year-olds throughout Black and brown communities across this country. So that's kind of the lens that I first approached this. That's the what for me.
Okay, thanks, Soffiyah. Bob, I'm going to come to you next. What do you most clearly see when you look at this issue in terms of a public health issue?
For many years, I've been writing about the degree to which, as a person doing HIV/AIDS research, HIV was present in many communities of color in the 1970s, long before we recognized the fact that it was there. Those of you who've had a minimal course on health education know that HIV is asymptomatic in its earliest presentations. All right, 1973 comes around and we suddenly decide to make a war on the group that is probably most likely to have been exposed to HIV. We lock them up in great numbers. We put them in settings where risk behavior that transmits the virus is definitely going to be present. And then in many states and in many municipalities, we send them back to their communities. I'm convinced, as are so many epidemiologists in the United States who've looked at this problem, that one of the major factors that seeded HIV in poor communities of color was the circulation of men and women in and out of prison during the period of time that we were waging this war on drugs. Another problem is associated with the fact that as a highly stigmatized condition, what greater stigma could you have than be someone who is living with HIV/AIDS and being a person who is formerly incarcerated? The fact that we have not been that successful, why mince words? The fact that we haven't been at all successful in having effective preventive programs for HIV in black and brown communities is at least in part a function of the fact that that group that is living with the virus is so stigmatized that it is extraordinarily difficult to get communities to organize, to do what is necessary to keep everyone who is present in that community safe and sound. The third, and I think most important factor, is that no community that I know about in the human family can suffer the loss of so many men and women and not have the social fabric of the family and of community life terribly disrupted by the fact that folks are gone. I want to suggest that one of the reasons we've not been successful in preventing HIV infections in these communities isn't just that we haven't been able to mobilize communities. The structures, both formal and informal, that we would normally call upon to get people to mount an effective campaign against this threat has basically disappeared because so many folks are gone. That so many young people grow up in the vacuum that's created when families are torn asunder means that all the factors that are necessary to keep this virus rolling and to keep other health disparities rolling in these communities are uniquely present. As a way of saying that this has more than economic consequences, mass incarceration and this war on drugs have probably done more to damage the health of affected communities than any other thing that I think those of us who work in these arenas can imagine.
Thank you, Bob. So Neill, you're probably one of the persons that people would be most surprised to be part of this conversation if they don't know about you and they don't know about LEAP. So can you tell us with some illustrations about how drug policies focus on punishment actually undermines policing?
Sure, and have my notes here, so because she's got me on a clock. I hate to be on a clock. The last time I was here at this historic church, I realized how I'd unwittingly become a part of a system that we're talking about here today that's responsible for so many problems that we are experiencing in our communities, in our neighborhoods, and in our families. You know, I thought I'd become a part of something that was going to improve things when it was just the opposite in law enforcement and policing. You know, I've spent over 34 years in policing with 3 different departments, as you heard in my bio. After 23 years, you know, I retired from the Maryland State Police and went to the Baltimore Police Department, where I was recruited to command training for them. I initially refused that offer, as a matter of fact, but then I realized something. I realized that this was an opportunity for me to influence not only the largest police department in the state of Maryland, but it was that of my hometown, which was very important. At that time, I'd seen significant change in Baltimore policing since I lived there and grew up there in Baltimore. And I thought that as the head of training, I could do something about that. So what are some of the change that I speak to, that I saw? A murder rate over 300 per year for many years. We even had a renowned TV show called Homicide on the Streets. Rapes were very high, robberies and property crimes the same, disrespect for police, high rates of complaints on police brutality issues, and the inability for police to solve violent crime or any crimes outside of drug-related crimes. You know, the common political answer for this was, you know, quickly became more funding for more police and more prisons. And it remains today. You know, citizens, not just the young, despise the police in Baltimore. We arrested so many black men for drug-related crimes. I mean, and the numbers remain staggering today. New York City knows about that, obviously, with stop and frisk. We filled our prisons, believing that crime would improve. It didn't. Well, in a sense, it did improve, but in the wrong direction. We decimated families income, values, protection by sending so many fathers and heads of households to prison. We sent boys to prison where if they weren't associated with a gang, they soon became associated with a gang. Prisons aren't institutions of higher learning, not intellectually. Soon returning to the streets to be better prepared for a life of crime on the streets. This wasn't just Baltimore, this was every major city across the country. But Baltimore was what I knew. So the cycle continues. You know, police disrespect and violate the rights of people. Dissension grows. Police cannot solve crimes because they are busy battling drug dealers and drug users. Citizens don't trust the police, therefore refuse to partner in solving crime. The police need the community to solve violent crime. It can't be done without the community partnering. So as I close here, here's an example. California. Change in California arrest rates between 1990 and 2008 are as follows. Rape, down 67%. Murder, down 63%. Robbery, down 46%. Violent crimes as a whole, down 33%. But marijuana possession arrest, up by 127%. So decades ago, we started down this path of over-incarceration. We punish and incarcerate our citizens at a higher rate than any other country around the globe. Russia, 6 times that of the UK, are 2 examples. So at the end of the day, our criminal justice system of incarceration has not made our communities safer, but just the opposite.
Thank you, thank you. My colleague to my right has been involved in reform and working on this level, both domestically and internationally. So what I think would be useful for us to learn is, what have you learned about the multidimensional aspects of the war on drugs over time, domestically and internationally?
Thanks, Kim. You know, I just think sometimes people ask me about how I got involved in this and you know, why I do this, and I think about my own evolution, sort of growing up, you know, born in the city, growing in Westchester, Sabbath observant family, traditional, going off to college, and 70s, beginning to smoke marijuana, and liking marijuana, and seeing people getting in trouble for marijuana, and seeing alcohol be, which I like too, but a lot more problematic. And then some years later, going to graduate school, and by this time it was the 80s, and that kind of period of liberalism and kind of live and let live of the late 70s was beginning to be pushed back. It was like the Reagan Revolution. And my interests were international relations, international politics, and I began to look at this drug issue. I just got fascinated by drugs and crime and the whole international thing. And the more I looked at it, the more I could not believe the extent to which the war on drugs, by which I mean both this assumption that certain drugs need to be treated first and foremost through the criminal justice system, and secondarily this belief that the only permissible relationship between human beings and certain drugs is one of abstinence, that you must be coerced to be drug-free, that war on drugs was just permeating and polluting and distorting things everywhere. So I'm looking internationally at Latin America, and this is the 1980s now, and the stuff going on in Colombia and Peru and stuff like this, and the levels of violence and crime and corruption and black markets and all of these eradication campaigns and all this, and I'm going, what's this like? This is like Chicago during the days of Al Capone. And we know what happened then and what the solution was. Then you start to realize, well, there's people around the world growing marijuana or opium or coke. It's part of their traditional culture, and yet they're being fumigated and eradicated by planes funded by the U.S. government that were just indifferent to their health. And then you come back to our own country, and this is the 80s, and you see the craziness of the drug war and arrests going up and up and up, and then incarceration going up and up and up. And then you see this almost like McCarthyism, right? A rebirth of McCarthyism's kind of fused through the lens of the drug war, playing on people's fears and paranoias, legitimate fears, but also craziness about drugs. And so you start to see massive levels of incarceration. You start to see rhetoric and zero tolerance and drug-free and the most offensive type of almost stuff that reminds you of the stuff you heard about in Europe in the 30s and stuff like that. And that's happening in our country. And then then HIV comes along, not just here, but everywhere else. And you see we're allowing hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people to die of HIV when we know how to stop the spread of this disease, but we have people saying that drug addicts are better off dead and that we got to dealing with drug addiction before we deal with stopping a deadly virus for which we have no cure. And then you see people dropping dead of overdoses, not just from the drug per se, but because they're getting them from a black market. And then you see people going to their doctors and not being able to get the medications they want, or doctors being afraid to prescribe different types of pain-killing medications because the DEA or somebody else is looking over their shoulder. And then you have kids going to schools in DARE programs with packs of lies. I should say that. One page is accurate, next page is a pack of lies. Next page is accurate, next page is a pack of lies. Being taught this nonsense, right? This disrespect. Then you see scientists being paid by the government to do drug abuse research and realizing that their efforts to try to do legitimate drug abuse research is like trying to do honest social science research in the old Soviet Union. There's just certain questions you're not supposed to ask and certain answers you're not supposed to give. And the vicious hypocrisy of the whole thing. That somehow alcohol and tobacco are okay, and but those ones are not. Realizing the extent of that, and then looking historically and seeing the extent to which, when you ask why some drugs are illegal and some drugs are not, you realize it's not based upon any medical or scientific decisions. It mostly has to do with who used certain drugs and who is perceived to use certain drugs, and that distinguishes why some are criminalized and others not. So for me, this was both, on the one hand, a fascinating intellectual puzzle that I had to work on as an academic, and something, on the other hand, a fantastic injustice, both in my own country and around the world, that was worth committing a life to try to get rid of. Thanks.
All right. So first of all, I want to thank all the panelists for coming out, doing their triple toe loop, and staying on time. And now we can stretch out in the conversation a little bit. So I'm going to reverse the order, and Evan, since you have the floor, and you so evocatively painted the picture for us of both domestic and international dislogics around the war on drugs. Give us a why. Tell us your analysis of this. What are the driving forces around it? What frames do you use to help people understand this madness?
Well, I think the most fundamental and basic one is the profound ignorance and fear and misunderstanding about the reality of so many drugs in our society. It's the way people can routinely think that alcohol and tobacco are fundamentally safer than the rest of these drugs. It's the ways in which people will see drugs as animate objects, seizing and jumping out at people. It's the ways in which we analogize this to eradicating drug addiction, eradicating a drug like eradicating a disease, forgetting the fact that there is no market for smallpox or tuberculosis or things like this, but there are markets for things like this. It is the rejection of any sort of understanding of basic markets and the understanding that what we're dealing with here are essentially global commodities markets, and that marijuana and cocaine and heroin and opium are essentially like the markets in alcohol and tobacco and coffee and chocolate and tea and precious metals and everything else, and that if there is a demand, there will be a supply. But that fundamental ignorance sort of perpetrated and encouraged by our government, I think that's the first why, the first explanation of what's going on. I think the second thing is how much this is connected with race, with racial and ethnic prejudice in our society. Let's face it, there's no way we would have this many people behind bars in America if most people sitting behind bars were white people. It's just inconceivable that we would do that, right? If you look at the origins of the drug laws, how we first criminalized, opium or cocaine or marijuana because of their respective associations with Chinese and with blacks and with Hispanics, you can see it's about racial prejudice and that sort of thing. If you look at the criminalization of the coca leaf in Latin America, it's about prejudice against indigenous, darker-skinned people. You look at what's going on in other parts of the world, very similar as well. Then there's the third thing, which is really more of a modern manifestation. Because keep in mind, our record high rates of incarceration are not deeply embedded in our history. It's not as if America's always led the world in rates of incarceration. This is a modern phenomenon in the last 30 or 40 years, right? But what's happened is the emergence of an enormous prison industrial complex of people, millions of jobs, and billions, tens if not hundreds of billions of dollars supporting this. And not just directly within the prison industry, but beyond that as well. And then, of course, it's the horrible political pandering and the benefits that politicians saw, to doing that sort of stuff, to jumping on the drug war bandwagon. And then, of course, it's what holds back and retards reform now, which is not so much jumping on the drug war bandwagon, because that bandwagon is kind of run out of steam. It's the fear that if you step forward in the right way on this, that you might get Willie Hortoned, or it's that fear of how this issue can be used against you. And it's, to some extent, increasingly, it's the fear of your own shadow. But I actually think, that ultimately, the single most important way to engage in effective activism in this issue is to make a total commitment to self-education, to eradicating our own ignorance and fears and prejudices about every aspect of this thing, about the nature of drugs and the nature of drug treatment and everything else, and then taking that self-education process and making that an other education process. It is in educating ourselves that we become ever more effective advocates. The more we free ourselves of these ignorances and prejudices, the better we will be in ending this disastrous drug war.
So Neill, I want to get your perspective and particularly invite you to give us a sense of the why behind these startling statistics you gave. So arrests down on almost every major crime that we as a society think that we care about, all largely to pursue a particular policy that has never really been shown to create the public security and public health risk. So what is the understanding within law enforcement? What is the understanding more broadly about why this is sustainable?
Good versus evil. That's what so many cops believe. Mm-hmm. They believe this is about good versus evil. But before I go there, I want to say one thing. I am such a student of this. I've just been doing this work for a very short time, and Ethan talked about education as he wrapped up there, and that's what I'm doing. I am learning about the foundation for much of what we're talking about here tonight. One of my other teachers, mentors, is sitting in the audience, and that's Deborah Peterson Small. Just brilliant in this area, and I know Deborah would agree that, this is about economics. It's about social control. It is about controlling people. It's about making money. And the police are an excellent tool. The criminal justice system is an excellent tool for this. It's about the haves and the have-nots. And again, the police are right in the middle. And, from the political platforms that have taken place over the past few decades, on crime, being tough on crime. And, we in law enforcement believe that, and, that's part of what we're taught, as we're segregated, removed from community for 26 weeks, going through a police academy. The one I went through, I actually lived there for 6 months. And at the end of the day, you really believe that you are out there combating evil. And we have been taught, not just police, but many of us, many of you sitting in that audience have been taught to believe that people who use drugs are evil people, that people who sell drugs are evil people, when a lot of it is just about getting by. Many of the men who were arrested in Baltimore City over the past few decades, going back into the 1970s when I started in law enforcement, were men who had lost jobs, as in many of our major cities, because jobs were outsourced and went overseas. The huge steel industry in Baltimore left, and men without high school educations needed to feed their families. Many of them ended up in the drug trade, and police came in and started dismantling these organizations, locking them up, locking these men up one after another, and it continues today with their sons and grandsons. I almost started to talk about some possible solutions, but I'm going to wait.
All right. So Bob, I'm going to ask you a why, but with a slightly different focus. So you drew our attention to the intersections between the war on drugs and the HIV/AIDS crises. And at the same time as you were talking, it's remarkable how absent that intersection is in traditional racial justice advocacy, in traditional public health advocacy. In both topics, one doesn't always seem to bring along the other. So do you have a sense that there is an absence that needs to be addressed with respect to traditional kinds of racial justice advocacy, seeing where criminal justice and seeing where HIV actually come together as a way of undermining racial justice?
Good question, because I think for the longest time, folks in public health were much more content to think about what do we do to prevent the spread of this epidemic than to think about the dynamics that were creating it. So this was, for quite a number of years, ignored. But then I think within the last, I'm going to say 7 or 8 years, people started to do the numbers. Professor Ernie Drucker is out here in the front. He's one of the folk who pioneered pointing out how much the neighborhoods that had the highest rates of arrests for drug use were also the places where you had the highest rates of HIV. And then people started to make the connections. I think for the most part, what has been the focus of a lot of public health work has been to argue that we will accept much of what's going on that creates so many people living with HIV in prison. Let's make sure that whatever else is true, that there are opportunities for them to get drug treatment, and there are condoms for folk who are going to be sexually active, so that spread of HIV in the prison through the most frequently understood methods, drug use and unprotected sex, won't be further exacerbating an already nasty situation. When it became clear that a public health argument with public health logic was not going to affect either policymakers or, more importantly, the general public, I think that's when you started to see more and more folks say that this is really ultimately a human rights issue, not just one of public health. Don Desjardins, who's been doing HIV/AIDS research for many years, used to talk many years ago about data-free policymaking, where you could point to a lawmaker and say, here's the evidence, here are the numbers, this is what this looks like, do something about this. And with, for example, syringe exchange programs, one of the first things that folk would say is, well, you know, this is really a moral issue. I'll never forget the then governor of New Jersey basically saying that, I'm a mother, I think I don't want to send the wrong message to children that by providing opportunities for needle exchange programs, I'm also somehow sanctioning drug use. So there, a public health argument that had been made by scientists for years and years and years suddenly got put to the side because it suddenly became a moral issue. I think that's when folks started to see it's not about the science, it's about something else. And joining forces with human rights advocates is a way of pushing this as an ethical issue, not simply an issue that's best described by science, became, I think, part of the discourse that you're seeing going on right now.
Okay, all right. And lastly, Soffiyah, what is your sense of the why? And I also want to draw your attention to the why at the community level as well.
Well, I think Ethan alluded to it earlier when he talked about the economics behind it. There's so much money generated not by the people who are selling drugs, but by the people who are prosecuting and locking up and caging and supervising and monitoring the people who are using drugs and selling drugs, that if we were to suddenly legalize drug possession and drug selling today, if we think the economy is bad now, it would totally tank because there are so many jobs tied to it. And from the court clerk, well, you wouldn't need as many judges, you wouldn't need as many clerks, you wouldn't need as many court officers, you wouldn't need as many courtrooms. You wouldn't need as many transportation officers, you wouldn't need as many corrections officers, you wouldn't need as many jails. You wouldn't need as many prisons, you wouldn't need as many COs, you wouldn't need, I mean, you get the, right? It would tank, right? So that is why you have the unions who are representing the people who work in these fields having so much power. I don't even want to talk about how much power they have in California, and there are no slouches in New York either, pushing another agenda. That's why they don't want it legalized, because they really see the equal sign between their economies and the drug economy. So I think that's one piece of it. And there's another piece of it that we can never ignore, and that is, unfortunately, our thirst for evil. That we never seem to get over our basic sinful behavior of not respecting that every person is a person. And the more melanin you have in your skin, the less likely you are to be recognized as a human being. And as long as we could couch the war on drugs as the other, and we keep otherizing the people who are caught up in the system, then it was okay. So the class distinctions became very real because poor people went to prison and rich people went to very expensive drug rehabilitation programs in Florida and in Colorado and upstate New York, but poor people went to non-rehabilitation programs that were caged all over the state and all over the country. So we have to look at the class distinctions and the racial distinctions if we really want to understand what the why is.
So I'm going to ask you to hold the floor and help us think about the ethical shift, the political shift, the moral shift that has to take place. And you mentioned two things that resonate partly because we as a society have had a history with a market that dehumanized people and created investments that made it virtually impossible for that market to transition away from itself. And an ideology that animated that market, namely the inferiority of some groups of people. And by this, I'm talking about slavery, for example. So we had to have a civil war, an ultimate breakdown in both the market and some pressure against the ideology. What do you see as necessary to happen? What shift has to happen, either materially, economically, politically, to change the direction, see a significant shift in what you aptly described as a lockdown kind of situation?
Well, you know, one of the things that I guess in my younger, more radical years, I never would have thought would be something that would make a difference, because everything, of course, was in my control, was that the economy was going to get so bad. Okay, so because the economy is so bad, we have the undivided attention of policymakers who were ignoring us before, because now they're starting to be concerned that they can't afford to keep locking up so many people. Now, I only wish that it was the humanity issue that got their undivided attention, but at this point, whatever point of entree that we can get is important. So despite the fact that there's a lot of money being made to float the economy by all the people who are employed in the system, government officials will say, we only have so much money that we can spend on this, are beginning to look for other ways to cut costs. So that's one of the things that I think is driving it. But more importantly, if you ask me, like, what do I think needs to be done, I think really a radical overhaul of the system. I have really lost faith that we can kind of band-aid our way into a brighter tomorrow, because there's so many places where the system is fundamentally corrupt that I think we need a complete and total overhaul. I can only imagine that my board of directors will fold tomorrow when they get the tape of this speech. But that's what I really think is needed. There's just too many problems with it, and our psyche is so focused on there's got to be somebody to punish. We've always got to find somebody to punish. We're so revved up on punishing someone that we aren't able to seem to take a giant step backwards and say, instead of there's got to be somebody to punish, why can't we change the discourse to there's got to be somebody to heal? And you can't start to heal other people if you aren't ready to look in the mirror and find out what is it about yourself that makes you so focused on punishing somebody else that you can't think of healing. If we could actually get to that point, then maybe I'd have some hope for reform. But, you know, there's a lot of mirrors in the world, and so far they haven't succeeded in getting us to that point.
So, Evan, I'm going to bring it to you. So will the system run out of money, and will that spell the end? Are we looking for an ethical transformation of how we think about good and evil, or how we project all kinds of psychological and moral ills on others? Or is there some other door that you see as being available or necessary?
Well, I think there's multiple pieces going on here. You know, one of the really interesting pieces is the marijuana piece, because that's not what's filling the prisons, but it is half the drug arrests in America. And it is roughly 30% or whatever of the overall underground drug economy, I think, in the US and worldwide. That change is happening incredibly quickly. You look at the Gallup poll. You line up the Gallup poll on support for marriage equality, gay marriage, over the last 8 years, and the one for legalizing marijuana, they're almost exactly overlay, right? I mean, amazing what's happening. What Washington, Colorado just did, where Colorado gave more votes to legalizing marijuana than they gave to the re-election of President Obama, and he beat Romney big time there. I mean, really extraordinary. And then last month, this actually quite significant memorandum issued by the Justice Department, Attorney General Holder, basically saying, go ahead, we're going to give you guys a chance to do this. And the thing that's interesting, and I'm trying to figure out right now, is part of what's driving that increasingly. I mean, most of us involved with this are in this because we care about the civil liberties and civil rights and the racial justice and all the other sorts of arguments, but now money is coming in on side of the marijuana industry. And you're going to have good old American capitalism and other foreign capitalism getting behind taking this thing out of the criminal justice system. And I think that will have a very beneficial impact overall in terms of reducing arrests. It's not as if police won't find other ways to keep arresting young black people around their society, but there was something about that marijuana piece and the commodity piece that made arresting people for that much harder than the other things they might pick up on. Now, when it comes to the broader incarceration thing, that's a lot tougher. Because you see what's happening now, and it is beginning to turn. I mean, half the states reduced their incarceration levels last year. And the speech by Attorney General Holder a month and a half ago, in his more recent speech, making good on some of that stuff, there does now seem to be a real commitment to trying to reduce incarceration. So I think that is happening, but it is like turning around an ocean liner. And the fiscal things that Soffiyah was talking about, the problem there you have is that the benefits of the drug war are very specific to real constituencies. The budgetary benefits of a wiser policy are kind of spread out and more dispersed. So that's a real challenge there. The thing I think where we really, for my organization, Drug Policy Alliance, apart from taking marijuana in the criminal justice system, one of the other major things is just ending the criminalization of drug possession. What we would call the Portugal model in Europe, in America. And that's something where there is an economic thing that we could be pushing this forward with, but where the ideologies we have in our society about putting sobriety and drug-freeness on a pedestal and still believing that people need to be coerced to being drug-free, that's a powerful obstacle that's less about money and more about ideology.
So, Bob, I'm going to bring you in on this. So, we heard from Soffiyah about her surprise at being in a space now where potentially the economics of the situation might be the driving force. And we just heard from Evan the idea, Ethan, the idea that capitalism might in fact set us free, at least to a certain extent. What's your view about?
I think I'm the oldest one on the panel.
Yes.
So I'm 70. Okay. I was born in 1944.
Looking good.
Provost Davidson loves that. That means that I was around in the 1960s in the Civil Rights Movement. In fact, I was a field secretary for the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, working in Mississippi in 1964 and 65. I'm about to run for office, so please let me hear you. The most fundamental lesson I learned in that period had everything to do with community organizing. You recall that my first comment about how ineffective we've been in black communities to get folk to see that HIV/AIDS is a menace within our midst could also be extended to what's happening with the criminal justice system. People are aware that their cousins, their brothers, their sisters, everybody is at risk for being locked up. But other than being really afraid about it, and other than wanting to move out of the communities where there are high rates of crime, the community organizing that was so prevalent in the 1960s represents a spirit that has disappeared. I teach as part of the Bard College Prison Initiative. I've given lectures in Woodbourne, in Green Haven, Fishkill, you name it, where Bard is providing folks who are incarcerated with an opportunity to be college students, to get actual college degrees from Bard College. I'm seeing folk come back into the community who have probably less than a 5% chance of being part of the recidivism statistics. I've been organizing a specialty, a concentration, if you will, in public health for folks at Woodbourne, in which I'm saying you want to come back into the community, you want to do something substantial, not only to keep yourself out, but to create an organized effort within the community where there's now chaos. Think about coming back and doing for others what you and I are doing together here. I'm a fundamental believer that our ability to change American ideas about race and incarceration are probably not going to happen overnight. But I just have this belief that personal agency, where you give folk the sense that if they organize communities to do something themselves about all the conditions that have created not just the problems that are created by mass incarceration, but such widespread drug use, that it seems reasonable to ask folks who are coming back, who've been there and done that, to be a part of whatever effort we're doing to reorganize the community is an idea whose time has come.
So we're going to hear from Neill, but I want to encourage you to think about comments, questions, suggestions. I'm going to turn to the audience in just a moment, so get your questions ready. So Neill, you were about to get us started on this, so we're anxious to hear what are your ideas about both the police part and then the broader part. What can be, what's necessary, what doors are there for us to open?
I guess this is where I become more radical than Ethan. Beginning with drug policy, first of all, beginning with you, beginning with the people. Any worthwhile, significant change in policy always comes from the people. It doesn't come from Capitol Hill, and it doesn't come from your state legislative bodies. It comes from the people moving. As Robert was saying, it comes from the people organizing to get something done. In this day and age, what we're seeing now with drug policy reform is people moving. It was the people in Washington State, it was the people in Colorado who changed that policy in those two states. It was the same for the end of alcohol prohibition back in 1933 with repealing the 18th Amendment. State by state by state by state made that happen, refusing to embrace federal law for alcohol prohibition. So with radical criminal justice reform, again, it must be us. And I think what we need is a new system. Because it's not just about drug policy. When we do end drug prohibition, and we will, because we have to, when we do end drug prohibition, what's next? And we have to stay diligent. We have to remain diligent, keeping our minds focused on what's coming down the road next to control people economically, class, race, culture, you name it. What's next? And we have to prevent it from happening. As with criminal justice, and this involves policing, first of all, we need to be thinking about how do we have fewer police? How do we have fewer prisons? How do we have a smaller criminal justice system? That's what we need to do. And that involves digging down deep and solving the pain of people, why people do the things they do from a family level, from a neighborhood level, from a community level, and that involves all of us. We can't be focused on our legislators to do this for us. We need a system of restorative justice. Restorative justice. And some will go as far as to say prison abolition.
So I'm going to turn it over for a few minutes for conversation, and then I'm going to ask us to actually comment a little bit on each other. So I'll take questions in triads. So starting right here, yeah. Yep. Stand up, please.
What's next in terms of that total control? It's already in the works, and that's the war on terror. And I'm concerned that solution of organizing is going to come head on with the next war, because we live in a country where a major sector of our economy is dedicated to war, and that's the end of the world. And I think that when we get the organization to fight and to restore communities' health and empowerment, we're going to come head on with that new war that's abroad, which is the war of terror.
Certainly, certainly. So the question is that the thing that's coming next is already here, and it is the war on terror. And so many of our resources, so much of our orientation is already set up to actually fight that particular war. So it's almost an idea of endless war. War on drugs, war on terror. So how do we think about that in terms of steps for the future? Yes. So I'm going to turn it over to the panel and I guess elevate the question here as well, which is sometimes, historically, after the Civil War, there's so much celebrating about the minor, and I say that advisedly, transformation that was brought about. The more fundamental questions were perhaps left off of the table, and that continue to shape our social world now. So I think the idea is that there's ongoing wars, there are ongoing things that are happening, particularly war on black youth. So I guess putting many of these comments together, there is the question of whether we're just looking at one face of a longer, repetitive, re-articulated in a next moment orientation of our society, of criminal justice, of the state, to criminalize target populations, to justify the consequences of that criminalization, to use that for more criminalization. So in one sense, it's this idea that you mentioned, that it's hard to really change the direction of a ship. It might be more that there is no turning. It just is a matter of what is the next criminalization project and how does it build on the existing facilitation of the criminalization happening. So is there out, or is this just a nesting doll? We open up one, there's another criminalization. We open up another, and it's just a rabbit hole that we can't climb out of.
Can I just say that at the end of the last session, someone very correctly made the point that we are all quite good at looking at how bad things are, and we're even better at predicting how much worse they're going to get. That kind of discourse ultimately freezes us. It makes it impossible for us to act. We are just not able to move, you know. So, yeah, well, let me give you the benefit of having been on the planet this long. It's always been getting worse. It has never gotten better. There's no such thing as the good old days. The one thing I want to focus on, I'm a guy who's accustomed to having classes that last 2 hours long, so this 2-minute soundbite stuff is really hard on me. The one thing I want to focus on is, of all the folk who've been locked up, in black and brown communities especially, it should surprise absolutely no one that a lot of folk who were there are brilliant. I have classes that astound me, and it is almost all I can do not to be brought to tears to think of what a loss to the community, what a loss to the general republic it was, that so many of these minds are now lost to us. The idea that when you give them an opportunity to be educated, they can come back should alert us to one simple fact. If the prisons in the U.S. are slowly but surely being emptied, we haven't really thought enough about what we're going to do with the folk who come back. The re-entry problem has sort of been obscured by the fact that we're still stuck on how many folk are being put in. When folks come back, they are often really motivated to do whatever is necessary to make sure that they don't go back into that trap. Giving them an opportunity to think through, what do you do to organize? What do you do to become a part of a collective? What do you do to work with your neighbors who are sometimes afraid of you, but who recall that you're a member of the family, so that you become part of the solution instead of part of the problem? I think that's where we have to direct our attention. If we worry about the huge nature of the enormous threats that are coming internationally, who's surprised that as individuals we feel completely inadequate to respond? But knowing, for those of you who've ever taught, and for those of you who've ever taught some of the folk that I'm talking about, you know that this is an enormous untapped resource. Don't give up on them by virtue of giving up on the possibility of doing anything possible to change a system that is already corrupt.
Just a quick comment to piggyback off of Robert. I think that, well, first of all, at the macro level, our policymakers want us to feel as though we need them to keep us safe. You know, it's about fear. You know, the comment about the war on terror, you know, and what's next. Being afraid of our young black men, we know how that's put out there. You know, so it's about fear. It's about them wanting us to believe that we need them to keep us safe. So where am I going with this? The micro level, the community level, the neighborhood level. That's where we can really be effective in organizing and controlling our own little sphere. You know, and not just controlling what happens within a community, we should be controlling how the police act within our communities. To this day, I do not understand why we, as citizens, as neighbors, as community members, I don't understand why we accept the way police treat you today. I don't get it. From the brutality issues to shooting our brothers, our sisters, our sons, our daughters, to cursing at you because they feel like it, and nothing gets done about it. So at the micro level, we need to take control over our communities and our neighborhoods and our families and get things done there. And if we do that across the country enough, these microorganisms will eventually come together.
So Neill, let me follow up on that, because I think from inside law enforcement, you have a perspective that actually might be useful. It could be, on this particular question, it could be that communities learn a sense of learned helplessness, a sense that there is nothing that we can do, and we know other contexts in which people get caught up in thinking there is no way out. In the same way that Bob is pushing back against the grand historical notion that there is no way out, we might as a community think it happens to us all the time, there's nothing we can do about it. But maybe we're not aware of how fragile this commitment to maintain this approach to our communities is, or what the levers are that might actually be pressured so that we don't have to take it anymore. So from inside law enforcement, what's your sense about the possibilities that communities can stand up and demand that the kind of policing that we experience need not happen anymore?
Yeah, I think it can be done. It's being done here in New York in some communities. And you know, where neighborhoods have organized to things such as using cell phones to take videos of every police interaction. See, when you try to fight the police by yourself, you're going to lose. It's just that simple. You're going to lose. But when you come together as a community and work together as a community to control and to monitor how the police behave within your neighborhoods and what they do and what they target and who they target, you can make things happen. And see, at that small level, you know, that community can decide who that city council person's going to be next time around. And the mayor. Especially in cities like Baltimore, during the last mayoral election, you only had an 18% turnout. You'd be surprised what a community can do if they organize and come together.
Wonderful. Sophia, you want to comment?
Yeah, I wanted to actually go back to the first question that was posed about the concern about bumping up against the war on terrorism. And I just wanted to remind us that, you know, America always declares war on something going on within its borders. It declared war on communism, war on poverty, war on drugs, war on terrorism. All of that equals war on people. I mean, that's at the bottom of it. The war on poverty really demonized the people who were poor. The war on drugs demonizes the people who are using drugs. The war on terrorism demonizes the people who are being terrorized by U.S. All right, so we needn't really worry about what's the next war the U.S. is going to declare domestically, because it's all going to equal the war on people. And I think Neill and Bob make a really good point that we can't paralyze ourselves by being concerned about what's the next war the U.S. is going to declare. They're always going to declare domestic war and international war. That's what imperialists do. We have to be about how we're going to bring about fundamental change. I think Neill laid out a really useful blueprint, and some of those things have been used in New York City. We can't obviously ignore that, you know, if as your daily experience, every time you come out of your front door, in the next 2-hour period, you're likely to be stopped by the cops 5 times. That's going to impact kind of your mindset as to how much power you have in the situation. But it is true that if we bond together, our likelihood of being successful is much more likely than if we try to address the problem one by one individually.
Ethan?
Yeah, this is going to be the most uplifting comment or not, but on the one hand, I do think that this ocean liner of mass incarceration is turning. It's going to take a long time, it is, but it is already turning, and I think this turn is going to accelerate. And I could well see the number of people incarcerated in America dropping from the 2.3 million today to under 2 million, you know, in some years to come, and even accelerating in that direction. But I want to offer 2 caveats on that. The first one is that the paradigm of mass incarceration, of becoming comfortable with locking up people at a rate that is, you know, 5-6 times the global average, notwithstanding the fact that our rates of illegal drug use and nonviolent crime are not that much different than a lot of other societies. I think that's hard to break that paradigm, right? I'm afraid that we're going to set our sights short. I mean, what our grand objective should be in terms of mass incarceration is we want to make America average. right? We want America's incarceration rate to be at the global average, but that means a massive de-incarceration in America, and I think we've become so accustomed over the last 40 years, it's almost take a biblical analogy, it's like the 40 years in the desert of Israel, it just became so accustomed to slavery that you needed new generations to even imagine a different way, a different paradigm. But then the other piece and the other caveat is this, and this first hit me after 9/11, and it goes to the first person's question about terrorism and such. I can well see us reducing incarceration in our country by some significant but insufficient percentage, and replacing it, or substituting with it, a system of massive surveillance. So see America's incarceration numbers going from 2.3 million down to 1.5 million over the next 10 to 15 years, and see the number of people under the supervision of the criminal justice system going from 5.3 million, or whatever it is today, to double or triple that, right? Now, mind you, it's not as bad as being locked up behind bars, right? To have electronic bracelet and all these sorts of things is not as bad. But that fear of becoming what Gary Marx once called the maximum surveillance society, and it taking two forms, right? What I would call internal surveillance and external surveillance. On the one hand, being more and more inclined to want people, both government and employers, wanting to know what people are putting in their bodies. If you are building up America's healthcare costs because of your bad habits, your cigarette or your drugs, or even your fatty foods or whatever, just, more and more surveillance of what we put in here. And then on the other hand, external surveillance, concerns and desires to know where people are. And quite frankly, it is on the one hand about terrorism, and on the other hand about immigration, illegal immigration, right? The notion, wait for the next major terrorist episodes to happen in America, and if they start happening with the frequency we've seen no obvious reason why that's not going to happen, then people are going to get very freaked out. And then if this issues over illegal immigration just keeps continuing, more and more Americans are going to be saying, we want to know who every single human being on our soil is. We want a means to identify them. And I can well imagine, we already have these things which tell anybody who wants to know with the power to do it, corporate or government, where we are. But the GPS devices, imagine everybody's got a little GPS device in their body, as well as the little drug testing, or, what have you taken, all unified, right? And of course it's wonderful because, now, your elderly grandparents with Alzheimer's wander off, you can track them down, your kids run away, track them down, you want to know, all sorts of benefits to surveying people. But that then runs into issues where there are going to be huge efficiencies in creating a maximum surveillance society. And the only obstacle to that is going to be a profound sense that we actually care about freedom enough in America to say that that is not permissible. That the economic and maybe even public health benefits of massive surveillance are not enough to cede our fundamental freedoms when it comes to the power of the state and large corporate entities. And I hope that America's got that kind of passion for freedom to hold off against that sort of onslaught.
So it gives us a strong sense of, I guess, the difference between a freedom discourse and an anti-mass incarceration discourse, right?
To some extent,
Yeah. So I see a question over here, so I'll take several. Yes.
Along the way about incarceration and drug and how we're going to solve these problems. At the outset, when you were talking about the education system and the beds that will be assigned to students in grade 4 by what they score on state examination, that has been a clear indicator as to who will eventually end in the criminal justice system. And also, there is a very strong element of parents putting their students in there. Sophia, you talked about one of your people that you knew in Boston whose mother had put him, signed for him to be in special ed to help her get SSI for her habit of drug and depression or whatever. it's an epidemic of students being placed in special education and are staying in special ed because there is an economic base from the household. And about drugs, if you go in any school throughout New York State, I've served at state level as a building and a district level administrator, and I see the behavior early on with kids queuing up for their meds. I saw it in Bridgehampton, I saw it in the South Bronx, and immediately I saw kids with too much money and kids with no money having the same type of patterns. So, you know, we're not addressing an institution and a structure that's in place that's allowing students to get into special education. They can't get in there without a signature from their parents. They don't do well on grade 4 examination. So it's a pipeline that's going to carry them directly to the criminal justice system. How can you guys speak to that?
Okay. I saw a hand over here.
Thank you. I'm sitting here listening to all these brilliant panelists, and I'm confronted with the question of an empire. That, yes, we're talking about the prison industrial complex and punishment and drug policy, but it seems to be connected to the crisis of capitalism, of how do you manage people? You know, do you survey them? Do you put bracelets on their ankles? And, you know, like the crises of capitalism. So we can talk about these side issues, but one thing we know, for those who have studied mathematics, there's a concept that says system of simultaneous equations, that says you have to have the same number of independent equations as you have unknowns or variables. So this has to be a comprehensive conversation. Certainly we're not going to get to that answer tonight, but when you bring up freedom, freedom is the thing that ties all those things together. So I'm hoping that the panelists will say, given where we are as a society, and this is not a democracy, what is the crisis of capitalism, and what is it that we can do as an organized body? What critical mass can we create that we can really make a difference in this generation?
Okay. Right here, the gentleman with the blue shirt.
Hi, thank you, everybody. I'd like to talk about a little bit. I think when we talk about mass incarceration and the war on drugs and all these kind of compartmentalized things that we study in order to understand the whole, is that we sometimes get lost in the forest somehow. And for me, mass incarceration is not the problem. Because to go back to your remark about social control has been around here for a long time. We didn't need mass incarceration. We had chattel slavery or Jim Crow and then the ghetto, because there was a form of social control that probably controlled as many people that are in prison today. I think that when we start talking about the outer edges of what's happening, we're talking about the cough. You know, we're living in a society that has a disease, and we're worried about the cough. But the cough is only an indication of a deeper problem. And that problem is something that I hope we can kind of briefly kind of get at, so that moving forward we can talk about this. My thing is that mass incarceration isn't the problem. It's what's underlying mass incarceration, the thought process that creates mass incarceration. And Soffiyah was talking about retribution. And we live in a society that's really into retribution. We want to make somebody pay. That's where the war analogy comes from. Because if something happens, we got to make somebody pay. We have to drop a bomb on them. We have to incarcerate them. We have to do something to them because we got to get even. And that is almost encoded in the DNA of our culture. And I believe that we have to start attacking it at that level. We have to start talking about a different language that counteracts, that fights against the main principle of retribution, and kind of replacing that with a different language. And it's also like, you know, if you deal with addictive behavior but just taking away the drugs and not on the underlying issues, then that person is just a dry drunk in the kind of the language of substance abuse disorder. We have to get at the core of it. And I appreciate all that we're doing around the edges of that, but we're not talking about what's fundamentally driving mass incarceration. We're talking at the edges of it.
Okay, thank you. So I'm going to take quickly the last 3 questions. If you could work with us and make them short comments or interventions, I think we'll be able to give all the panelists an opportunity to address them. So I'm going to do a sweep, and when I go like this, please wrap it up. Okay, right here.
Hi, thank you. So I spent my last year in school, doing a thesis about mass incarceration, specifically. And it was, I'm very grateful to have had that time. And I feel like I spent that year really in an abstract way, thinking these things, because it was so academic. And then I moved to New York, and it was kind of shocking to see a lot of the things that I've been reading about kind of play out on the street every day. And so I think that I've had these moments where I had thought I had developed these politics, and I came here and I kind of realized I started to question them, seeing some of this stuff. And so I guess, sorry to be not so long-winded, my question is, how do we balance our long-term goals of prison abolition, or not relying on reform, and moving towards places where people can take care of themselves and their family in a good way? Because yes, I don't believe in the war on drugs, but I also know that drugs and violence are linked and take tolls on communities, you know? And so how do we balance all that, the long term and short term? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. 3 more, shorter than that. Okay, right here in the arch.
Hi, thanks for a wonderful panel. I'm going to be real quick, make a point and ask a question. The point is that I think there's a general sense in the room that our problems are beyond mass incarceration, that it really is about mass criminalization that goes from everything from the way we criminalize poverty to substance abuse to mental health, and that we need to have an answer to that. But my question has to do with the fact that we've been talking about drug policy here as if it was a primarily American problem. But this is in fact a global prohibition regime. And while it's not executed as extremely in the rest of the world as it is here, it is a global thing that has the same impact in sort of holding up certain interests of people. And I was thinking about what Professor Fullilove said about solutions, and having been here for a while, and I feel like we're in a very similar place politically and economically to where we were in the 30s and 40s, dealing with some of the same challenges coming about the crisis of capitalism. And so my question for you and for any of the other panelists are, what is it that we can learn from the way that we've responded in the past to these kind of crises, both as a country and as an international community of human beings, that should inform the way that we take on dismantling the global prohibition regime?
Thank you, Deborah. Right here.
So I want to thank you guys, first of all. My name is Clay, and I serve in a middle school. I work at a middle school, 424 in the South Bronx at Hunts Point. And I'm also a part of, if you guys heard of Cop Watch, I do Cop Watch patrols. I'm part of PPM, People Power Movement. And my question to you really is, I was really taken aback. Someone said about capitalism solving its own problem. And I was wondering if you guys could link that to the rise of the nonprofit industrial complex and a bunch of basically like Band-Aid scab organizations. And you know, kind of like, what do prisoners produce? Like, prisoners just don't go to prison and just sit there. Like, they make things, you know, like products for Victoria's Secret to Nintendo or whatever. So like, how does that link of prison labor to or the plight of organized labor movements in the larger prison outside? So.
Thank you. And one last question I saw over here. Yes.
Thank you all. I'll be very quick. I know we've discussed at the macro level and also at the micro level, so most of this has been, these questions have been at the macro, so begin with the micro. I'm really, really grateful for Neill for your comments, but also I want to bring it back to a statement that you made about why people in the black community and minority communities allow themselves to be treated so poorly by law enforcement officers. Professor Crenshaw, I'd like to link some of your research into this. One, people from these communities have to engage institution. And as you admit, Neill, that the police force, you go up against them in their own internal review system, you're most likely going to lose. And the reason is because of, because of credibility. So based on something that I read from Crenshaw a long, long time ago, and I use it often, how do we use the law, which is stacked against most is my mic being cut off? Well, how do we use it? How do people in the community use it to their own advantage so they're not abused by people with power and law enforcement?
Okay, thank you. So I'm going to start with a vision. The vision is 9 o'clock, and we're all out of this room. That's the vision. That's what we're trying to get to. And we have just about 15 minutes to make that happen. So that means we have 10 minutes, probably 7, to actually answer these questions. Thank everyone, give the applause, and leave. So I'm going to suggest that each of you take one of the questions that you feel most motivated to address. And in your conclusion, give us your sense of the low-hanging fruit, what we can grasp now, and what we can really reach for. So the order, I'll just invert it. Neill, I'll start with you. Bob, Sophia, and then Ethan.
Okay, so I'll address a question about how can we use the law within our communities. And I can go many places with this, but I'm going to go to the most important law, and that is the Constitution of the United States. First of all, teaching our young people, not just our young people, many old people don't know what their constitutional rights are. You know, the Fourth Amendment, protection from unreasonable search and seizure. You know, the Fifth Amendment. So teaching our young people not just about their constitutional protections, but how to interact with the police, how to maintain their cool, exert their rights, but then again, it's going to take the community, all those community members who happen to witness an interaction between police and someone, to stop, spend a few minutes, a little bit of time to observe while that person who has been taught how to protect their constitutional rights, how they interact with the police. And I think that's the most important and quick information I can give you right now about how to use the law to protect yourselves. By the way, my wife is home, Ethan. I just pulled up her phone, and she's home. At least her phone is.
Bob.
So, two observations. One is that I think in institutions like this one, we are absolutely obligated to try and come up with an analysis. And I think what many of us have discovered is that the more you peel the onion, the more you see that there are layers that we hadn't really imagined. It's why I keep going back to the notion that we don't want to get so hung up in our analysis of what's going on that we are lacking the power to think that we can do something about it when in fact we can. Now, a number of people throughout the day have made reference to Putnam's book, Bowling Alone. Let me just say that as an educator, of all the things that I've seen us disinvest in the United States, the one institution that is primary is education. Most school boards in urban areas that allow you to vote for members of the board often have rates of voting participation that are less than 20%. We've more or less understood that our schools are the source of the problem, but we have, as individuals, abandoned them and really have decided that it's up to the teachers or the teachers union or the Board of Education to make things better. There was a time when folks were much more invested in their schools. Neighborhood schools used to mean more than just the building that was on the corner. There used to be a sense in which people really invested in the young people who were there. community participation in school events was much greater than what we see now. And if we are beginning to see the problems of mass incarceration as being a function of poor reading scores at the 4th grade level and above, thinking that we have a role to play in changing that might be one of the most important solutions we could possibly adopt.
Thank you. Thank you.
I wanted to address the question of why do we allow the police to treat us this way? And I'd like to change the question. Why do the police treat us this way? Okay. Why do our governments fund police forces that abuse the citizenry? Okay. I think that's really the fundamental question. I resist the idea that we quote unquote blame the victim for the abuse that they've been subjected to. It reminds me of the question, quote unquote, why didn't the slaves fight back? The question might be, who had the guns? The same questions today, who has the guns? Who has the power? So I think that we can demand that our government officials, why do they allow it? And in some ways we might look at the most recent mayoral election as people voting with their feet on that question and saying, if you're down with Ray Kelly, then we're raising the question as why do the police treat us that way?
Thank you.
Yeah, it's funny, so many of the questions were about sort of the failure of democracy and the nature of capitalism and all this. And I guess the way I tend to think about this more generally is, you know, America, we have the world's oldest continuous democracy. But one consequence of that is that we have the world's most sclerotic democracy. Hence the Tea Party and the phenomenon that the president well described of, you know, one faction of one party, of one house, of one branch of government holding the country hostage. I think with capitalism, and those of you who made that point, I mean, it seems to me, look around the world today, and, you know, capitalism, in some respects, won. But capitalism takes a huge number of forms, and there are more pernicious forms and more benevolent and more creative forms. And capitalism can be a force both for evil, as it has been in fueling the war on drugs in so many respects, and as I suggested before, I don't think it's going to push for change, you know, when I made the comment about marijuana, but I think it's one that will help lock it in once that stuff happens and they see their opportunities. But, you know, I think what a lot of this comes down to, because I really focus on the drug piece of this whole thing. Uprooting this, and I think, Kimberlé, you may have mentioned at the very beginning, that deep-seated thing, that global thing, as Deborah was asking about drugs, this global drug prohibition regime we have. It is not just an American thing, but a global thing. Uprooting that, I think on some levels, it's when you look historically at the extraordinary fears, the fear that the sky would fall, that society would end, if we allowed people to pray to their own God, if we allowed people to read their own literature or print what they wanted, if we allowed people to have the freedom of speech or the freedom of assembly, if we allowed people of different sexual preferences or whatever to be, each time we thought the sky would fall. And I think the notion that ultimately we have to come to that same enlightenment when it comes to the element of psychoactive drugs in our society, it's in some respects a radical idea. But the notion that our fears around psychoactive drugs in our society and around the world today very much resemble those fears around what it would mean to allow the free exercise of religion, press, assembly, speech, or whatever, that there's something fundamentally similar there. And I really think, to end where I started, that until we can dig deep enough in ourselves to actually see this issue of psychoactive drugs globally in that light and in that respect, we're going to keep fighting for reform while we keep digging ourselves back in a hole. I think we can do it, and I'm really glad that we're all here tonight. Thanks.
Well, amazingly, we've ended with 8 minutes to spare, and I'm going to keep us on track by refusing myself a few comments from the law. But I'm going to tell you all that we can pick up some parts of the law piece on Monday at the law school, and I think you guys have seen some of that. So first of all, I want to ask all of you to join me in thanking our wonderful panelists, Neill, Bob, Sophia, and Ethan. And thank you all. See you tomorrow.